Hi, North Decatur family. Brittany here with you once more as we walk through the book of Acts together. This week we are in chapter 13 of Acts. Specifically today we're going to be looking at verses 13 through 41. It's a pretty long chunk, so I need you to stay focused. We got this. All right, so where are we? Barnabas and Saul, known as Paul, have been sent out from the church at Antioch by the Holy Spirit. And they are traveling and they are speaking of the good news of Jesus. They go up against a magician. They win over a Roman proconsulate, the political leader. And then they continue on. And so in verse 13, we pick up and they're out at sea again. And then John goes back to Jerusalem. And then they put in at Pisidian Antioch. And they on the Sabbath, and they go into the synagogue, and they sit and they listen to the scriptures being read, the law and the prophets, and then they're invited to speak. Brethren, if you have any word of exhortation to the people, say it, is what it reads. So Paul stands up and he says a lot. He basically covers the entire scope of the Old Testament. He goes through the Gospels. He talks about Jesus. He talks about John the Baptist. He pulls in Psalms. He references David. I mean, it's like the Bible's greatest hits right here in, not that many verses. He does it in half of verse 16 through 26. And then he goes further. And he says in verse 26, he says, "Brethren, sons of Abraham's family, and those among you who fear God, to us this message of salvation is sent." It's beautiful. It's beautiful. He talks about how Jesus was condemned to death, how although they could find no evidence of him committing a crime that would deserve death in the ancient days in Jerusalem, that he is given over to Pontius Pilate, that he's given over to the Roman authorities, that they do not want this man to live, and they put him to death. And they hang him on the cross, and he dies, and they bring him down, and he's buried in the tomb. Spoiler alert, you guys know what happens next, right? Yes, God raises him up. God has fulfilled this promise to our children in that he raised up Jesus, is what Paul says to the people in the synagogue that day. And he goes back again to the Psalms, and he talks about David, and he talks about the promise that God made to David about how his descendants would always be on the throne of Israel. And this is when it gets real. Because he says, "Therefore, let it be known to you, brethren, let it be known to you, that through him forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. And through him, everyone who believes is freed from all things from which you could not be freed through the law of Moses." And the law of Moses is all of those titchy little things that you find in the Old Testament, especially in Numbers, Deuteronomy, Leviticus. It also refers to, of course, the Ten Commandments, the original law of Moses. All of these rules that the Jewish people had concerning how they were going to live their life. These were the rules that were supposed to free them from sin, free them from the things that separate them from the love of God. And so what Paul is saying is that all of these things that never freed you from separation from God, this guy has done it. Jesus came, he lived a life, he died on the cross. God raised him up in defiance of sin and death. And if you believe in Jesus, you too can have that freedom from the law of Moses, freedom from sin, freedom from the separation from God that brings us all torment in our hearts. "Therefore, take heed," says Paul, "so that the things spoken of in the prophets may not come upon you." And he quotes, "Therefore take heed. Behold, you scoffers, and marvel and perish, for I am accomplishing a work in your days." God is speaking, of course. "I am accomplishing a work in your days, a work which you will never believe, though someone should describe it to you." And that's my question and my challenge for you. You know the stories. Some of you know them better than others. But most of us watching this video today know the general scope. There's an Old Testament. There are things about slavery, and there's things about, not mixing crops, and, wearing the right clothes, and not eating fish on Friday, and, And then there's Jesus. And Jesus came, and Jesus was a baby, and Jesus taught us about loving one another, and then Jesus is murdered. And then Jesus rises, we know the scope. But do you know about the work that God is accomplishing in our days? Do you believe that God is still accomplishing work in our days? If someone should describe to you the work of God today, would you believe it? Would you be believed if you described the work? And we got to believe in the work of God today, because we're looking around in a world that's overwhelming. There is hatred and injustice and pain and sorrow and violence all around us. And it's easy, like Tyler talked about, to be influenced by voices that are focused on those things. So I challenge you to believe in the work that God is accomplishing in our days, that God is still accomplishing mighty things today. I hope that you are well. I hope that you know how loved you are, both by God and by this worshiping community. If you should ever need help or a kind ear, anything at all, please reach out to us and let us be of service to you. Be well. Goodbye.